What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to yet another Overwatch League discussion video. In today's episode, I'm going to be taking a look back at some specific pickups made during the 2018 offseason to see if they lived up to the hype in 2019. Oh, and by the way, this video idea was given to me by Oblivion Wing on my Discord server, and if you'd like to see one of your ideas potentially get turned into a video one day, then make sure to join the Discord server through the link in the description. Anyway though, many teams made acquisitions during this time that were looked at as massive, whether it was through a trade or free agency. The plan is to exclusively look at the moves that a majority of the community was talking about, so sorry if I don't bring up any specific signings that you think may have been super hype. And that's basically what today's video is all about, so without further ado, let's dive straight into it, shall we? So hype signing number one that I wanted to talk about is the Vancouver Titans picking up the entire Runaway roster. At the time of this acquisition, Runaway was the #1 team in Korean contenders. They just pulled off a spectacular comeback over Gangdu Panthera to win contenders, and they took down the 2018 South Korean World Cup team in a show match. A lot of people will argue that these guys were league ready way before these events even occurred, but their run in contenders is what solidified the chance for them all to play together on the same Overwatch League team. Since day one, I think most people expected them to be good since they'd been practicing GOATs for a long time, and they were really good at it long before they joined the league, but I'm pretty sure they still found a way to surpass a lot of people's expectations with how dominant they truly were. They got a Stage 1 title, they had the best record in the league, and they made a Grand Finals appearance. Everybody on this team more than held their own against the competition, and many of their players were considered to be top tier at their respective positions. It's also worth mentioning that Hoxel won Rookie of the Year, and that both Janu and Twilight were in the running for MVP. With all of this in mind, it goes without saying that this acquisition made by the Vancouver franchise more than lived up to the hype given to them by fans and experts alike. Moving on to acquisition number 2, we have the Hangzhou Spark signing Guxue. At the time, the Chinese main tank player was considered by most to either be the best or second best player from China depending on how you feel about Leaf. His skill at the main tank position, and more specifically his Winston, had people talking, and the way he performed in the 2018 World Cup only got fans more excited to see him join the Overwatch League. And when it was announced he would be joining the Hangzhou Spark, people instantly were saying he'd be one of the best players in the league. Some experts were even saying he'd win Rookie of the Year or maybe even MVP. Strangely enough, nobody seemed to care that he'd be joining a primarily Korean roster. Not that many people seemed too worried about potential communication issues, but early on in Stage 1, it was clear that this was going to be a problem and that it would take some time for Guxue to learn a new language in order to be on the same page with his Korean teammates. At first, it appeared that Guxue would not play up to his expectations thanks to that language barrier, but around halfway through Stage 2, Guxue finally started to look more comfortable, and once he hit that point, he never really looked back. Guxue was without a doubt a top-tier main tank in the Overwatch League. Some people may even say he was top 3 at his position depending on who you're talking to, and who could blame those people? If you look at the season as a whole, Guxue played very well. Statistically, he was at the top, and he was more than passing the eye test as well. Although Reinhardt was far better, Guxue still played a good amount of Winston during the GOATS meta and found plenty of success. His Primal Rage mechanics were still as good as ever, and his Winston was so dangerous that the opposition had to pay crazy amounts of attention to him. I've mentioned it here on the channel before, but some teams were so afraid of Guxue's Winston that they would devote tons of their resources just to try and take him out of the equation, and in some situations, teams would solo ult him, like when the Valiant solo EMP'd him that one time. But the problem with this is that Guxue's teammates would take full advantage of this and would usually win games because the opposition was giving too much attention to Guxue. It's also important to mention that Guxue was no pushover on Reinhardt or Orisa either. And like with Twilight and Janu, Guxue was also one of the 2019 Overwatch League MVP selections. So when you factor in all of these points, it's pretty clear that Guxue lived up to the hype. Now let's transition over to the Gladiators signing Roar and Decay. So after trading away Fissure during the 2018 offseason, a lot of people were questioning what would come next for the Gladiators. Fissure was a huge reason why this team found success, and trading him away to the Seoul Dynasty now left this team with a huge hole at the main tank position. Not to mention, they were now missing a true hard carry that the team could play around. But then they come out and make a huge splash in free agency by acquiring both Roar and Decay from Gangdu Panthera, and this really got people talking. Some fans and experts even saw them as a true title contender. I myself jumped on the Gladiators bandwagon as well. Gangdu Panthera was a damn good Korean contenders team. They were just one map away from beating Runaway and winning contenders. This team was filled with good looking prospects, but out of all of them, I would say that Roar and Decay were the two who were getting the most hype from that roster. Both of them showed a ton of promise, and they seemed like they could become big stars one day if groomed properly under the right system. This especially goes for Decay. He was seen as a player who might be the next big DPS superstar in the Overwatch League, and that probably helps explain why there was such a big bidding war over him. After all, The bidding prices were rumored to go over $300,000 for him. So needless to say, Decay was one of the most sought-after free agents in the league, and the Gladiators picking him up along with his teammate was seen as a major accomplishment. But although the Gladiators would go on to become a top 5 team in the league record-wise, neither Decay or Roar had a profound impact towards their team's success. While both of them were good players, they were a long way off from being great players. In my honest opinion, neither of them even came all that close to being considered stars in the league. Roar was honestly pretty average when you look at him compared to every other main tank in the league. In fact, Roar had his fair share of struggles. Early on in the season, you could really tell that stage nerves and communication issues were hurting this guy. Things did start to improve as the season progressed, but you could tell things weren't perfect with how often he overextended during the GOATS meta in particular. Overall, he was very inconsistent, and by the time it was all said and done, the Gladiators decided to send him over to the Justice and replace him with OGE. And while Decay was good during the GOATS meta, nobody was really calling him a top 5 Zarya player in the league or anything, and he did show promise on heroes such as Genji, Tracer, Widowmaker, and Mei, but he still wasn't really playing at that superstar level that many people in the community thought he would. And like with Roar, he found himself on a new team by the time the season came to an end. Overall, I would say the off-season acquisitions of Roar and Decay more than fall under the category of didn't live up to the hype. They didn't quite play up to that level the community thought they would. Moving on to off-season move number 4, we have Striker getting traded to the San Francisco Shock. In Season 1, Striker was a superstar in the Overwatch League. His prolific Tracer made him a dominant force that very few DPS players in the league could keep up with. But after some rumors of him and Boston not being on the best of terms came out, the Uprising decided to trade him away to the San Francisco Shock in return for some money. The Shock were already being considered to be a good team heading into 2019, so picking up Striker put them into the conversation of potential title contenders. Unfortunately for Striker though, his services would not really be of use until the role lock was implemented. With Sinatra and Rascal being extremely good on Zarya and Brigitte respectively, Striker found himself consistently being on the bench until around stage 4. But although he spent so much time riding the bench, Striker didn't seem to miss a beat when the time came for him to be relied on again. His Tracer was still as good as ever, and he really seemed to have made good improvements on his Widowmaker. But more than anything else, he ended up becoming one of the best Reaper players in the league during the playoffs. If Sinatra or Troyobin weren't the ones making the big plays, then it was most certainly him. His playstyle made him a good option that this team could consistently rely on for stability. In my opinion, Striker played a pivotal role towards the Shock's late season success. His well-timed flanks and Death Blossoms almost always came up big in the clutch. Although Striker wasn't utilized a ton until close to the end of the season, I would say he definitely lived up to the hype thanks to his consistent performances in Stage 4 and the playoffs. Next up, we have the Seoul Dynasty acquiring Fissure. After Fissure and the Gladiators had their falling out, it became obvious that he wanted to play for an all-Korean team. Not only that, but he wanted to be the leader who had full control again. So when the Dynasty were interested in trading for him, it seemed like a match made in heaven. Fissure needed the Dynasty, and the Dynasty needed him. And I would say that most people were pretty excited about Seoul after this acquisition. Main tank was one of their biggest issues in 2018. They couldn't seem to settle on a starter. But having Fissure, who was one of the best players in the world during this time, could easily solve that problem. And at first, Fissure was definitely living up to expectations. With Fissure at the helm, Seoul was able to pull off many accomplishments just in Stage 1 alone. For one, they finally made the stage playoffs. That was something they were never able to pull off in Season 1. Not only that, but they also got their first ever playoff win, and they did it in spectacular fashion by defeating the NYXL, which was one of their inaugural season rivals that they had never beaten up until this point. With all of this in mind, I think it's fair to say Fissure lived up to the hype. But the thing is, Fissure kind of just became a non-factor after Stage 1 and found himself retiring from Pro Overwatch temporarily after this. So while his impact was felt when he played, his time being an important piece on the Dynasty was very short-lived. So in a way, I'm kind of neutral with this off-season acquisition. He lived up to the hype while he played, but he didn't play for a super long time. Also, I don't think he played quite as well as he did in Season 1. He was still good, but not at that hard carry level. Fissure kind of lived up to the hype, but not as much as people thought he would. He was not the savior of this team, but he definitely did help jumpstart their successful season. Next up, we have the Paris Eternal signing a fully European roster. Heading into Season 2, it was believed by some that the Paris Eternal would be one of the better GOATS teams in the league, since Europe was known for being one of the better regions when it came to this composition. And when they picked up experienced veterans such as Soon and Shadowburn, along with Cruz, who found great success on the UK's 2018 World Cup team, all signs pointed to them possibly being a pretty decent team. While I personally never really felt that way about them, there's plenty of people out there who truly did. This was the team that was going to represent the true power of Europe, right? Well, no, not quite. In fact, I would make the argument that most of their players were pretty average at best. This especially goes for the GOATS meta. Other than Shadowburn popping off like one time on Pharah, what else did he contribute in stages 1 through 3? He was a below average Zarya player and just a meh brick. I do think his May looked pretty alright in Stage 4, but at that point it was too late for him to secure a job for Season 3 on Paris. As for Soon, he dealt with similar problems. He arguably had a bottom 5 Zarya in the league, and it wasn't until Stage 4 where we would finally see him play consistently. The same can be said for guys like LH Cloudy and Finzi. In my opinion, the only player who was anything close to consistent throughout the entirety of the 2019 season was Cruz. Everybody else could only show flashes for the most part. It's a shame the Eternal didn't sign players from contenders who were more talented than the ones they had. The EU region really isn't bad at all. Paris just so happened to sign a lot of the wrong players in my opinion. It's obvious Paris was a pretty big flop, so I can safely say that they in no way lived up to the hype in Season 2. And finally, to wrap up the video, let's talk about the Atlanta Reign signing Dafran. So this guy kind of shocked the world when he announced he'd be coming out of retirement to play for the Reign. It was pretty unexpected, but it was something the community welcomed with open arms. I mean, how could they not? Dafran has such a big following, and at his peak on Selfless, he was one of the best players in the world. We all knew he'd probably still be a decent player because he's gifted mechanically, but the question was whether or not he could keep a level head. And as we'd soon find out, the answer to that was yes and no. It became pretty obvious early on that Dafran wanted to quit, but he kept his composure until Stage 1 was over, and overall, he was a pretty good player. He picked up Zarya, which is a hero he had little experience on, and he played her pretty well. I wouldn't go as far as saying he was one of the best Zarya players in the league or anything, but he was still pretty serviceable. And although his time with the team was short, Dafran definitely had his moments. He made one of the most memorable plays of the year when him and Masa did the over-the-roof grab on Hollywood, and who can forget about his DPS? He didn't play it often, but when he did, he was the center of attention. His Torb on Ilios well was something none of us could ever forget, and watching him play some Hanzo and Tracer was always a pleasure as well. While he wasn't as dominant as he once was during his Selfless days, Dafran was still a key piece in Atlanta's early season success, and let's not forget about how much he helped with increasing this team's popularity. Many people found themselves becoming Atlanta fans thanks to Dafran. His short tenure with the team was pretty successful. He helped bring in the wins, the viewers, and the fans all at once. I gotta give it up to Dafran here. He lived up to the hype in more ways than one. But like with Fisher, I think you can only say he lived up to the hype to a certain extent since he retired immediately after Stage 1 ended. So while I think Dafran did do a good job, my stance on his impact is still pretty neutral. It was great for the time he was there, but it was very short-lived. And with that being said, those are some of the moves from the 2018 offseason that either did or did not live up to the hype. What other offseason acquisitions can you think of that either did or didn't live up to the hype? Make sure to let me know down in the comments section. If you enjoyed today's content, by the way, then I would really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you'd like to further interact with me beyond YouTube, then consider following me on Twitter at ATP Overwatch and joining my Discord server through the link in the description. And that does it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate your support as usual. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.